Hi everyone. So I recently read the Storygrid Masterwork, Storygrid Analysis of Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda. And I am going to do something of a review, kind of talk back about it with you. So let's start off by describing what this is. So the Storygrid started from, a blog from an editor called Shawn Coyne. That was a long time ago. And I believe the book was published like 2012-ish. The podcast started around 2014, I think, 2015. I remember listening to it in first year of university to fall asleep, which is not an insult. There's great stuff in the podcast. Their voices were just very soothing. I liked it. Since then, they've really grown, exploded. I've talked about the Storygrid a lot on my channel. It's been a while, so they've stopped doing the podcasts now, to my knowledge. They have a new YouTube channel that I'm planning on reviewing and chatting through at some point. They have a whole Storygrid University that I actually participated in once, and I wish I had taken more notes so I could give you a review of it, but maybe at some point if I decide I want to go into it, I will, and do a little bit of it and be able to report back. But they also have all of these books, not just theory books, these books which are analyses. And basically, what they do is they go deep on what they call masterworks, which are books, are stories generally actually, that are so good and so representative of their genre, and they're so beloved and so resonant that they are very instructive and good stories for writers to learn from. So in this case, we're calling Hamilton a masterwork, and we are analyzing it. So, what is the structure of this book? The first part of the book walks through, it gives sort of an intro to the Hamilton story and justifies why it's a masterwork. It goes through the Storygrid methodology. It talks about Hamilton's global genre, which is a status story, which is why I chose this one. It talks about its subgenres. It has war, it has performance, I think. It has love as subgenres. Sorry, my notes are just over here. It talks about the controlling idea. It defines the controlling idea. It goes through the conventions, obligatory scenes. It's really about defining these terms and defining them in the terms, I guess, where appropriate, of Hamilton. So walking through, these are the conventions for a status story, and then they say, like, here are the ones that Hamilton has. And they also talk a lot about the status genre in that introduction as well, to get you shaped up. The second part is an analysis of every scene in the show. I believe it's broken out by song. So there is, Alexander Hamilton, My Shot, etc. are the names of the chapters in this book, and they analyze it scene by scene. For other texts, obviously, they have Treasure Island, they have Pride and Prejudice. Notably, I think these are ones that are in public domain, which makes sense. Those are all chapters. What's interesting about this book, so I guess the first con, because I have a lot of pros, but the first con of this, and it is not Storygrid's fault at all, it is me for making an assumption. When I saw Hamilton deep dive analysis, because I also have the Pride and Prejudice one. I got it a long time ago when I was part of Storygrid University, so it was like included. I got it for free, and it had the full text. And so I assumed they would have the script or the song lyrics or something to Hamilton, but no. So in the first section of the book, it says how to read this guide. How to use this guide, and it suggests watching the full Disney Plus Hamilton show and then watching it scene by scene and reading afterwards. I've seen the show on Broadway and I know the music really well, so I didn't do that. I just read it because it seems like a lot of stop and go to me. Stop, go, stop, go, stop, go. That probably would be the ideal way to read it. And for the record, that's like the first page. So if you'd purchased a sample beforehand instead of just buying it, you would have seen that and not been surprised. But that's just a note. Sometimes it could be helpful to see the text on a page, and that ideal way of going to read it is a little bit right. So if you don't love that, the Hamilton one might not be the one for you. Okay. Let's go into the, so that's one of the cons about it. I'm going to do this a little bit differently than my original. I'm doing like one con, I'm doing like all of my pros now, and then I have a little bit of like a caution notes at the end. So overall, and there's one other con, so we're doing the cons all at the beginning, as I said. The other con, and it's not really a con, it's just around who this book is for. If you haven't read anything in the Story Grid universe, if you're not familiar with the terminology, this is not a good place to start, because it uses all of that Story Grid terminology, like controlling idea, conventions and obligatory scenes, 4 core framework, 5 commandments, blah, 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 blah. And although she does give brief introductions to some of these things at the beginning, it will just be overwhelming, I think. So you either need to like read some articles on the Story Grid website, watch some of their videos, like maybe get the Story Grid 101, which is the free book. There's also the Story Grid. I have mixed feelings on that book. It's useful. It's poorly structured, I think, in my opinion. So it can get a little bit confusing. So I would go a lot deeper on the Story Grid principles. And I would be familiar with those before you pick up one of these Masterwork guides. It is good for people who are familiar with the Story Grid, preferably who are familiar with Hamilton, who have interest in the status genre, and who want to go much deeper on the Story Grid principles through examples. Alright, so here are all of my pros all together. This book is extremely well done. I think this fills a lot of gaps left by the book and the blog and the materials in a way that is like more succinct and more like value for time than the podcast. There are really, really great podcast episodes, don't get me wrong, but some of the later ones just felt so pedantic in theory and philosophical, which some people love and I didn't. I'm all about examples. So this is like a better use of your time, I think, to go deeper on the Story Grid than listening to like 300 podcast episodes, if that makes sense. So it's more similar to the Editor's Roundtable podcast, which was a podcast where they had 5, 6, I think, Story Grid certified editors who would all look at a different story each week. So they've done things like Love Actually, Crazy Rich Asians. What else have they done? There's a ton. They've looked at popular stories, some like TV shows and stuff too, I believe. Those are the 2 that I remember because I re-listen to those sometimes because they're relevant to my current book. So, woohoo! But it's similar to that, except it goes even deeper because you're able to analyze scene by scene. And this is so interesting. It's like close reading, but with a writing lens. It's so interesting, but it's also very instructive. And I get so excited about seeing a story broken down at this level of detail and looking at it at all the micro kind of parts of it. I think it really helps with the studying. And I do very firmly believe in the Story Grid idea of studying masterworks. I've done that with my books. I should do it more. It takes so much time, but I learn a lot from it. And sometimes you're able to model moments in your book off of those masterworks, and it can be very helpful. In fact, actually, what I thought was really cool is the author, I think her name is Abigail. She's also obviously done a ton of research on Hamilton and Lin-Manuel Miranda. And one of the anecdotes in here is that the initial scene where Aaron Burr meets Hamilton was apparently modeled on the scene where Malfoy meets Harry, or Harry meets Draco Malfoy in Diagon Alley in Harry Potter, which I thought was super cool, and I could immediately see the parallel because Draco Malfoy is trying to like give Harry advice on where he's gonna, like what's gonna happen at Hogwarts. He has a particular view, and Harry is kind of like trying to decide whether to say he disagrees with the view or not. And so I thought that was it was really cool. And it's like kind of a coincidental meeting, and then you meet them again in context. I thought that was a really cool parallel, and I really enjoyed that. All those little tidbits are great. So, in the analysis section, there's a summary of every scene, which is helpful if you are like me and are too lazy to go to Disney Plus and rewatch it. Also, they've started introducing commercials on Disney Plus recently, like they changed the whole payment structure. It is hideously upsetting, and I can't deal with it. I think I'm canceling my subscription. I hate commercials. Anyways, like everybody does, but it's not worth it to me. So anyways, if you don't want to pay for a Disney Plus subscription without commercials, you can just read the summary at the top and maybe listen to the song too. I did a little bit of that before you read the section. So she summarizes the events. And then she goes over the 4 core framework, which is basically what I can suss out is trying to nail down the story event or like the core thing of the scene. So it asks questions like, what are the characters literally doing? What is sort of their tactics? So like, what do they want and how are they going about it? What changes in terms of the value shift? Again, if you're doing a story grid spreadsheet, this is why you kind of have to know the whole lingo, that value shift would go on your spreadsheet. And then it has you sum the story event, which you would put also on the spreadsheet. A story event is an active change of a universal human value for one or more characters as a result of conflict. What I found really interesting about this is that these notes are really helping my understanding of the story grid. I will talk about that in more depth in 1 second. So after the 4 commandments, after the 4 core framework, they have the 5 commandments. So she defines the 5 commandments for each scene: your inciting incident, your turning point, progressive complication, your crisis, your climax, your resolution. And then there are the notes. And ladies and gentlemen, these notes are gold. I love the notes section. I think that the notes are just like observations. They're not like over structured or anything, but that's where a lot of the learning really is coming in. So there's so many like valuable nuggets in here, and there are so many things that I was like, oh, like that's what it is? I didn't know. So for example, let me go back here. Okay. Let me go back here. So way back in the first part, when they're talking about a status story's subgenres, and they're explaining what those different genres are, they don't only point out books that also have those genres, they point out specific characters in books that are following that subgenre, which really helps understand that genre and character arc go hand in hand. So they say that status has 3 different genres. There's admiration, there's pathetic, and there's tragic. Consult the story grid for more information of what that is. But they say, well, in Hamilton is the main character, and he has the status tragic story. But Eliza and Washington have the status admiration subgenre or character arc. And Aaron Burr has the status pathetic character arc. And that just clicks. That makes so much sense to me. Others, so in the controlling idea here, they took the controlling idea of a status story, which is something around like failure results when a striver sells out for unworthy goals. But then she looked at the story further, and she said, well, the story doesn't end when Hamilton dies. It actually keeps going, and it becomes positive because what Eliza does for his work. And so she extends the controlling idea to reflect the fact that we have Hamilton's arc, and then we have that add-on that makes the story end, hopefully, and makes you think about remember his legacy. So the overall controlling idea is failure results when a striver sells out for unworthy goals, but if a heroic figure picks up the torch and preserves his story's lessons, humanity is enriched. Great, like that's so cool. I've never seen an example of story grid changing the controlling idea like that to fit better what the story looks like. And I think it's a great acknowledgement that not all stories are following exactly that that typical genre arc. That sometimes, most of the story could go down and then it goes up or whatever. And I like the example of how they changed that controlling idea. And there's so many examples of how they just go deeper, like pointing out that your conventions, like a mentor figure, the conventional characters that you need in a status story. You can have more than one character fulfill that role. They point out, they really get into the status of it by saying, like, here is when Hamilton becomes tragic. This is why. They really define things. So the definition of the value shift, which is always very confusing, but here she says, think of universal human values as descriptive words used to explain how the main characters in the scene have changed, including their external circumstances or their internal condition from the beginning to the end of the scene. That's one of the best definitions of the value shift that I've heard, because it can be very confusing. I like how she says specifically it's descriptive words, because you're like, should it be like, what is a value? Does it have to be like courage, bravery? No, it's just a description of the character's state. I think that's really helpful. She also points out that a scene may include several value shifts. Again, super helpful. And there are so many things, and that's just in the preamble. And then you get into the scene analysis. And I just have so many highlights I'm looking at here. But what she's really doing is pointing out what she's really doing in the notes is pointing out like other levels to the story. And so, for example, she will explain why certain choices have been made. For example, in the very first song, we hear Aaron Burr say, "I'm the damn fool that shot him," right? And she, in the notes, goes into why this works, why telling us the ending, which in some stories would be a terrible idea, is a good idea here, and how that creates dramatic irony, and how that allows us to focus on the why as our major dramatic question instead of the what. Other little tidbits, like progressive complications don't always need to be negative. The resolution for the scene can occur in the next scene, the next song, the next chapter. So the structure of songs and chapters is not necessarily reflective of like one scene per. It's really, really interesting, really, really good stuff. And I just gave a couple of small examples there because I didn't want to read through all of my notes. It probably wouldn't make that much sense out of context. But the overall is that you're seeing the principles in practice, and you're able to get into the nitty-gritty of creative decision-making through the notes section of the analysis, and understand how sort of story grid and like other story principles are intersecting with what we're seeing on the page, what decisions led it there. Obviously, we're not hearing this from the writer themselves, we're hearing it from an outside perspective, a story grid editor analyzing. I don't think that makes it any less valuable. It's incredibly interesting. There's great insights. And if you like the story grid methodology, you learn a lot. And I think a lot of things that I've been confused on before when I'm analyzing a story, for example, I don't know where the resolution is. Like, I don't think this chapter has a resolution. There's that explanation as well as an example, like tied in together, of how you can split those up for tension and for pacing. So I said I had one more con at the end. I don't want to end on a bad note, but it's not really a con so much as a cautionary thing, is that I always warn people not to get too caught up in the story grid minutia of the vocabulary and the words and such. I think when you're writing a first draft, and when you're writing a draft in general, even when you're editing a book, a lot of these things can be useful to you. They're all useful for analyzing other books and learning from them. When you're writing your own book, especially in the drafting phase, I think leaning too into the story grid methodology and being too analytical about it can be a negative. It can be a hindrance rather than a help. I think the concept of the 5 commandments is great. I think thinking about what changes in a scene, the turning point, all great things to think about, but getting into like, what is my 4 core framework, or what's the avatar, and there's some other things they have in here, like the luminary agent. Like, a lot of these are just, they just get so deep in the analysis that I think they don't become practical anymore. And this is a full analysis. It's really interesting. It's helpful for understanding the principles, but it's important to remember that it's an analysis. It's not like a how-to write a book. We're analyzing, and all of those tools may not be appropriate for when you're writing your own book. Also, just sometimes in general, they get, like, listen to this sentence. We're drawn to seminars to consume the imparted wisdom of an icon in the arena, but we leave with something far more valuable than the curriculum. We get to meet the universe's other pilgrims and compare notes on the terrain. My note was, oh dear God. Because sometimes it just gets a little philosophical for my taste. That was only the front part. I have not seen any of that in the actual content of the book. It's just kind of the, like, flimsy woo-woo of some of the story grid's more philosophical things. I've always had trouble with their metaphor of, like, writing a book is like being a story grid, and you get to the point where you're having your all is lost moment as a writer, and I'm like, no, I don't want that. I just want the writing stuff. Some people love it. I do not. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that that can sometimes sneak in there. It's not really present in the analysis because it's very focused, but in some of the other materials, it drives me bananas, to be honest. But, you know, that is okay because there is so much value in this book. So I would love to know, what has your experience with the story grid been? Have you read any of these Masterwork books? I would love to hear about it. Would you like me to do a review of the Pride and Prejudice one? That one's actually done by Shawn Coyne. This was done by, I wish I knew her name, Abigail K. This was written by Abigail K. I also love how they put who it was edited by. It was edited by Sheila, Lishwi. Sure. Sorry. And the Pride and Prejudice one was edited by Shawn, so I wonder, you know, I'd be happy to compare and contrast some of those different writers as well, because I do have access to the Pride and Prejudice. But let me know your experience with it. Let me know if you've read these. Let me know if you've tried to analyze other stories using the story grid tactics, or if you've used the story grid structure, vocab, etc., theory in writing your own books. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this, give it a big thumbs up. You can subscribe, join, blah, 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 if you want to. And I will see you next time.